Thank you for checking out this presentation. I am presenting our research on an issue of video game regulation. In particular, this is the regulation of a potentially harmful quasi-gambling randomized monetization method found in video games, commonly known as loot boxes. Over the last 3 years, loot boxes have faced public controversy and scrutiny by regulators due to their similarity with gambling. If you attended last year's SLS conference, you may remember that I presented a theoretical paper on the cyber law track as to how I thought loot boxes should be regulated. This year, I am presenting a piece of empirical legal research that sought to assess how effective already imposed loot box law in China has been. This research is relevant to other countries as well because many countries, such as the UK, are currently considering whether to copy Chinese loot box law and impose the same measure. So, what is a loot box? Loot boxes are virtual consumable items in video games that can be opened by players to obtain randomized rewards of variable in-game and real-world value. They can take on many different virtual forms, such as treasure chests, car packs, or prize wheels. Our research focuses on paid loot boxes that require money to buy. These are seemingly more harmful as they can directly cause overspending of real-world money by players. Some games allow for player trading, enabling loot box rewards to be transferred between players. These systems may enable players to sell in-game items for real-world money. This means that these loot box rewards gain real-world monetary value. What can loot box rewards do? Some rewards are just cosmetic. For example, they may make your sword glow green or give you gold rather than copper armor without any increase in power. Other rewards actually influence gameplay. For example, they could unlock additional content or give the player a competitive advantage over other players, such as more powerful weapons. This means that players who paid for loot boxes can become stronger than other players, thus encouraging these other players to also buy loot boxes so that they can compete on a more equal footing. This may create a stronger incentive to buy loot boxes, which give a competitive advantage than those which are merely cosmetic. How much do players spend on loot boxes? We don't have conclusive data on loot box spending because this data is held by game companies, and they don't release their loot box sales data to the public generally. However, some publicly available data have been released. We've been able to figure out that just one single game generates a daily revenue of over $500,000 in one single country alone. Player trading of in-game items is also significant, with the virtual items of just 3 personal computer games having been transacted 1.45 billion times with an aggregated value of over $1 billion. Extreme cases of individual players' loot box spending have been reported in mainstream media, such as one UK player spending nearly £700 in 1 month. Another player spent over $10,000 in just 2 years on the loot boxes of one single game. The BBC also reported in 2019 on a case where 4 children spent nearly £550 of their father's money without permission and still failed to get the rare item that they were looking for from the loot boxes. What are the potential harms of loot boxes? The first potential harm of loot boxes is their structural similarities to gambling. They both involve the player or the gambler paying an amount of money with the hope of attaining more money or something more valuable through a randomized process. Secondly, empirical evidence has consistently established that there is a relationship between loot box spending and problem gambling. Specifically, that the more severe that a participant's problem gambling was, the more money that they spent on loot boxes, generally. I note, however, that we do not yet know if loot boxes cause people to become problem gamblers or if people who are already problem gamblers are more likely to spend a lot of money on loot boxes. Thirdly, loot boxes may abuse our natural irrational decision-making biases, causing players to spend more money than they had originally intended. These decision-making biases have been experimentally demonstrated to cause overspending in the context of gambling, and so may also be applicable to the loot box context. Some research on loot box prevalence has already been conducted. Loot boxes have become prevalent across all major video gaming platforms. 46 0.2% of video game players have reported buying loot boxes. We are particularly concerned about children and other vulnerable groups being exposed to loot boxes. The UK Gambling Commission has, for example, found that 22.9% of UK 11 to 16-year-olds have paid for loot boxes. Regulators around the world are currently considering whether or not to regulate loot boxes because of their potential harms and because of how easily children can have access to them. This is why the regulation of loot boxes is a global consumer protection challenge. Our research sought to contribute to the swift resolution of this issue. We conducted our research because, firstly, loot box prevalence research so far has focused only on Western countries. The situation in non-Western countries is not known. To address a global challenge, it is necessary to be informed by perspectives from different countries. This is particularly relevant because countries such as Brazil are also considering regulating loot boxes. Further, the effectiveness of the very few attempts to regulate loot boxes has never been assessed. Such assessments are necessary to guide future regulation to ensure effective consumer protection. As of now, the People's Republic of China is the only country to regulate loot boxes through a consumer protection measure. China requires video game companies to disclose the probabilities of obtaining randomized loot box rewards. Assessing how effective this measure is will help to resolve this global challenge, because measures found to be effective in one country can be recommended to other countries. Here are two screenshots to demonstrate what loot box probability disclosure means. In the example on the left, we can see that if we bought this loot box, we would have a 5% chance of obtaining an item of 5-star rarity. In the example on the right, we can see probabilities being disclosed for specific items. For example, a player has a 1% chance of obtaining Mario. Probability disclosure regulations have precedents in gambling law, such as in the UK. Prior research on disclosure-based regulations in other industries found that companies often do not disclose information in the most effective ways, so their ability to improve and inform the choices made by consumers becomes limited. For example, UK alcohol companies have not always met their voluntary pledges around health warnings. When used ineffectively or even perversely, these measures could even end up inhibiting informed consumer choice. For example, if the probability disclosures are hidden away at places where players are unlikely to be able to find them. This is why it is important to assess the effectiveness of loot box probability disclosure regulations. We do not know if video game companies will behave in a socially responsible manner by disclosing probabilities prominently. On the prevalence of loot boxes in China, we found that 91 of the 100 top-grossing iPhone games contained loot boxes. This is statistically significantly higher than the 59% found in the UK. We also found that 90.5% of games deemed suitable for children aged 12 and above contain loot boxes in China. This is again much higher than the 58.9% found in the UK. As for compliance, 4 of the 91 top-grossing iPhone games did not disclose probabilities. Chinese law gives a wide discretion to video game companies and recognizes as compliant if A, a disclosure is made on the loot box's in-game purchase page, or B, on the game's official website, or C, at both locations. We found that 61.5% of games disclose at only one of either location, compared to 34.1% of games which disclose at both locations. Disclosing at both locations would have provided players with 2 alternative methods to access the disclosure, and therefore would have made the disclosures more accessible than only disclosing at one location, and thus would have allowed for as many players as possible to access the disclosures. However, a majority of video games failed to do this. Even within the category of in-game disclosures, the method and accessibility of disclosure is extremely varied. I will take us through examples of each category, from those considered most accessible to those considered least accessible. 9.6% of in-game disclosures actually display the probabilities straight away on the purchase screen without requiring any interaction from the player. 11.5% used a small generic symbol, such as this question mark, on the top right-hand corner, but labeled it with the words probabilities, in order to show that it led to the probabilities disclosure. 55.8%, the majority, also used a small generic symbol to denote the probability disclosure, such as this I symbol standing for information in the bottom right-hand corner, or this question mark symbol in the top left-hand corner, which the player taps and then the probabilities are shown. These are less prominent than the previous disclosure category where the symbols also stated probabilities. 15.4% of in-game disclosures began with a small generic symbol, but then require some extra steps. This game, for example, requires the players to follow multiple hyperlinks and to do some scrolling to access the disclosure. Not all players may end up completing all these steps because it does take a lot of effort to go through all of the steps. This means that some players may never be able to see the disclosures because it has been hidden away. 5.8% of in-game disclosures were accessed through a graphic element on the purchase screen that is not seemingly interactable. This game, for example, unexpectedly requires players to tap an incense burner, which looks like part of the background, in order to access the probability disclosure. Finally, 1.9% of in-game disclosures could only be accessed by chatting with a customer support bot found in the game settings. This is clearly quite removed from the loot bot purchasing process. Also note that the game is entirely in Chinese, but the customer support bot is in English. We can see in the second panel that the bot does not in fact understand if you request the probabilities in Chinese. If a determined player does finally manage to access the disclosures, we can see in the right-hand panel that they will be faced with a daunting and almost illegible format. Now, I will also show you examples of the various categories of disclosures made on the game's official website. 9.1% of website disclosures had links on the homepage itself, which takes you to the probability disclosures. 1.5% of website disclosures were published under a separate tab dedicated to probabilities, which is quite obvious for the player to identify. 3% of website disclosures were made under the news tab, but pinned to the top of other news posts, making them quite prominent. 78.8%, the vast majority of website disclosures, publish the probabilities for their loot boxes under a news tab, but then listed them chronologically along with other posts. This means that older posts containing the disclosures are buried by newer posts. Therefore, players may have to do a lot of scrolling and clicking to go through the list before they find the probabilities that they are looking for. Also, many games have several loot boxes, and each loot box's probabilities are disclosed individually within this chronological list of news in its own separate blog post, making it even harder to find individual disclosures for specific loot boxes. Finally, 7.6% of website disclosures were not accessible at all when navigating the website from the homepage. Unless the player somehow already knew the URL, they would have to use a search engine to find the disclosure. To summarize, video game companies fail to maximize the visibility of probability disclosures. In terms of in-game disclosures, we consider the loot box's in-game purchase page as the starting point. We consider an in-game disclosure as reasonably prominent if the player can access the disclosure by searching for the words probabilities on that particular page. Only 21.2% of in-game disclosures were either displayed automatically on the purchase screen or were accessible by pressing a button referencing the words probabilities in Chinese. Automatically displayed disclosures are clearly the most accessible form of in-game disclosure, as it ensures that every player who may purchase a loot box is made aware of the probabilities of obtaining the rewards. However, only a small minority of in-game disclosures use this method. For official website-based disclosures, we consider those which can be accessed if the player searches for the words probabilities on the official website's homepage as reasonably prominent. This meant that only 10.6% of website-based disclosures were reasonably prominent. In short, video game companies fail to maximize the visibility of probability disclosures. Such suboptimal compliance is bound to negatively affect the effectiveness of the consumer protection provided by the regulation. In conclusion, it is clear that loot boxes are very prevalent in China, even more so than in Western countries. This means that the loot box situation in different countries may be vastly different and should be studied separately. Overgeneralization would not be helpful. we found that only a minority of loot box probability disclosures were reasonably prominent. Our recommendation is that legal regulation and/or self-regulation by the video game industry targeting loot boxes should require specific formats of uniform and prominent probability disclosures in order to ensure maximum consumer protection. After our study was conducted, we conducted a further study. This was a cross-sectional survey that participants self-selected into participating, so the usual disclaimers apply. We asked 879 video game players living in China whether they have seen probability disclosures in the video games that they play. Of the 428 participants who self-reported having purchased loot boxes in the past 12 months, 84.6% actually reported having seen probability disclosures. This reflects that most loot box purchasers have in fact seen probability disclosures despite them being implemented through suboptimal methods. Does seeing the probability disclosures reduce loot box spending? To answer this, we asked whether players bought fewer loot boxes and spent less money after seeing probability disclosures. Of 362 loot box purchasers who saw probability disclosures, 72.4% reported that their loot box purchasing behavior has not been affected. 19.3% reported buying fewer loot boxes and spending less money, and 8.3% reported buying more loot boxes. Now, what does the survey results tell us? Taken together, of all 428 loot box purchasers, only 16.4% reported buying fewer loot boxes and spending less money after seeing probability disclosures. This suggests that even if loot box probability disclosures are implemented prominently, their effectiveness at reducing spending is likely quite limited. A more interventionist measure may be necessary to effectively reduce spending and minimize harm. This is why regulators should consider a stronger measure in order to ensure a higher degree of consumer protection. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation. I will now take some questions. If you have any further questions after the Q&A session, or if you are not watching this presentation live, then please do get in touch with us using any of these methods. Thank you.